Welcome, weary traveler, to another journey through the shifting sands of time. As the stars wheel overhead and the night grows quiet, I invite you to rest your head and let your imagination wander to a land where the gods themselves could be murdered by royal decree. Picture this. You're a farmer in ancient Egypt. Your family has worshipped Amun for generations. Your grandfather was a temple priest. But tomorrow, your pharaoh declares your god doesn't exist. The golden statue you've prayed to since childhood, smashed. The priests who guided your spiritual life, executed. The festivals that brought joy to your village, banned forever. Therefore, you face an impossible choice. Abandon everything you believe sacred, or risk losing your life. Tonight, we explore a side of ancient Egypt that rarely makes it into museum exhibitions. The brutal religious reforms that shattered lives and toppled gods with the casual efficiency of a modern corporate restructuring. You might be curled up in bed right now, perhaps in New York as midnight approaches, or maybe in London as dawn creeps closer. Wherever you are in this vast world, I invite you to rest your head and let your imagination drift back 4,000 years. To a land where changing your religion wasn't just a personal choice. It was often a death sentence. We think of ancient Egypt as a place of eternal stability, golden pharaohs ruling unchanging kingdoms. But the reality was far more turbulent. Religious upheavals swept through Egypt like sandstorms, leaving destruction in their wake. These weren't gentle theological discussions over tea and papyrus scrolls. These were violent revolutions that destroyed temples, massacred priests, and turned neighbors against neighbors. Historians still argue whether these reforms were driven by genuine spiritual conviction or cold political calculation. But the suffering they caused was undeniably real. Tonight, we'll explore 12 aspects of this religious brutality. We'll witness the first monotheistic revolution in human history, Akhenaten's radical worship of the sun disk Aten. We'll see how temple economies controlled entire regions, making religious reform a matter of economic survival. We'll follow ordinary families torn apart when their gods were declared enemies of the state. But we'll also discover the resilience of the human spirit, how people found ways to preserve their beliefs in secret, how they coded forbidden prayers into innocent-sounding hymns, how they buried sacred texts in desert caves, hoping future generations might rediscover their lost gods. Some peculiar details emerge from this chaos. Priests sometimes continued performing rituals in empty temples for years after their gods were officially dead, like the world's first underground religious movement. One temple in Nubia allegedly maintained secret Amun worship for over a century after Akhenaten's revolution, though whether this is historical fact or wishful thinking remains hotly debated among scholars. The mainstream historical consensus holds that Akhenaten's religious revolution lasted only about 17 years. But recent archaeological evidence suggests the trauma extended far longer. Therefore, entire generations grew up never knowing religious stability. We'll see how women bore unique burdens during these upheavals, temple priestesses suddenly unemployed, mothers unable to teach children the prayers they'd learned from their own mothers. We'll witness the systematic destruction of religious art as workers chiseled away the faces of gods from temple walls with all the enthusiasm of someone deleting their ex from social media. Perhaps most haunting of all, we'll explore how these ancient patterns of religious violence echoed through Egyptian history, creating cycles of persecution and counter-persecution that lasted for millennia. Each new ruler seemed determined to outdo their predecessors' religious creativity and the body count that came with it. Behind every golden death mask in a museum lies a story of someone who lived through these spiritual earthquakes. Someone who watched their world's fundamental truths crumble like poorly built pyramids. So make yourself comfortable, dear listener. Let the cares of your modern world slip away as we journey to a time when the very gods themselves could be murdered by royal decree, where the line between heaven and earth was drawn not by divine will, but by whoever happened to control the largest army. Because in ancient Egypt, even the gods weren't safe from politics. Imagine waking up tomorrow to discover gravity had stopped working. That's essentially what religious upheaval felt like to ancient Egyptians. Their entire universe operated on Ma'at, cosmic order, divine balance, the fundamental law that kept chaos from swallowing existence whole. Think of it as the world's first operating system, except when it crashed, people believed the world would literally end. But this wasn't just abstract philosophy. Ma'at governed everything from the Nile's annual flood to whether your bread rose properly in the morning. Every Egyptian lived with the terrifying knowledge that their actions could tip the cosmic scales. Say the wrong prayer, the gods might withhold the flood. Skip a religious festival, your crops could wither. Challenge the pharaoh's divine authority? Well, that was basically cosmic treason, like hacking the universe's mainframe. Therefore, when pharaohs decided to reform religion, they weren't just changing church policy, they were threatening the very fabric of reality itself. The concept of Ma'at permeated Egyptian society so thoroughly that disturbing it felt like removing a load-bearing wall from existence. Historians still argue whether ordinary Egyptians truly believed the cosmos would collapse without proper religious observance, or if this was elaborate social control, but the anxiety was undeniably real. Picture an ordinary farmer named Keti. He rises before dawn, whispers the proper prayers to ensure his wheat grows tall. He leaves offerings at the local shrine, not from generosity, but from cosmic responsibility. If he fails in his religious duties, he believes he's not just risking his own fate, he's endangering his neighbors, his village, perhaps all of Egypt. But what happens when the pharaoh suddenly declares those prayers are wrong? When the gods Keti has served faithfully are branded as demons? When the rituals that supposedly maintained cosmic order are now punishable by death? The psychological terror was overwhelming. Modern anxiety disorders have nothing on the existential dread of believing you might accidentally trigger the apocalypse by praying to the wrong deity. Ancient Egyptian texts reveal this bone-deep fear of divine abandonment. The admonitions of Ipuwer describes a world where Ma'at has collapsed. The land turns around as does a potter's wheel. The towns are destroyed and Upper Egypt has become waste. This mainstream historical document captures the genuine panic Egyptians felt when religious norms shifted. Therefore, religious reforms weren't received as exciting spiritual innovations. They were experienced as potential extinction events. The Egyptians developed an almost obsessive-compulsive relationship with religious observance. Every gesture had cosmic significance. The way you held your hands during prayer, the precise words of invocation, the timing of offerings, all of it supposedly influenced whether the sun would rise tomorrow. Priests reinforced this cosmic anxiety with stories of divine retribution. They claimed that earthquakes resulted from insufficient temple offerings, that famines followed religious negligence, that floods came when the gods felt neglected. Whether they actually believed this or were running history's first protection racket is still debated among scholars. But here's where it gets particularly cruel. The system was designed to be unwinnable. If good things happened, the priests took credit for proper religious management. If disaster struck, they blamed the people for insufficient piety. It was like a cosmic catch-22 with eternal consequences. The quirky reality is that some Egyptian communities developed what we might recognize as religious OCD. Archaeological evidence suggests certain villages performed the same purification rituals multiple times daily, as if cosmic order required constant maintenance, like spiritual oil changes for the universe. Women bore unique burdens in this system. As primary caretakers of household shrines, they carried responsibility for their family's cosmic standing. A mother who forgot the morning offering to tower it didn't just risk her own fate. She endangered her children's souls and her husband's livelihood. Therefore, when religious reforms swept through Egypt, women often suffered the deepest psychological trauma. Their entire identity as spiritual guardians of the household suddenly became illegal overnight. Children absorbed this cosmic anxiety from infancy. They learned that improper religious behavior could literally unmake the world. Imagine growing up believing that stepping on a sacred beetle or mispronouncing a god's name might cause the Nile to dry up permanently. Talk about performance pressure. The mainstream historical fact is that Egyptian religious observance consumed roughly 20% of the average person's waking hours. Morning prayers, evening offerings, festival preparations, purification rituals. Maintaining Ma'at was essentially a part-time job that nobody could quit. But this system created a society perpetually balanced on the edge of cosmic catastrophe. Therefore, when pharaohs introduced religious reforms, they weren't just changing spiritual practices. They were shattering the psychological foundation that kept millions of people functionally sane. Natural disasters became theological nightmares. When earthquakes struck during religious transitions, people didn't see geological phenomena. They saw proof that the gods were abandoning Egypt. Every drought, every plague of locusts, every unusual Nile flood was interpreted through the lens of cosmic displeasure. Historians still argue whether Egyptian priests genuinely believed in Ma'at's literal reality or cynically manipulated public fear for political control. The truth probably varies by individual. Some priests were likely true believers, others sophisticated manipulators, most somewhere in between. The psychological impact was devastating, regardless of priestly motivations. Entire communities lived in constant fear of accidentally triggering divine wrath. They developed elaborate ritual calendars to ensure proper cosmic maintenance, like spiritual accountants balancing the universe's books. Some villages maintained what archaeologists call backup gods, secret shrines to alternative deities, just in case the primary gods failed or were officially banned. It was like having a cosmic insurance policy, which probably violated several religious principles, but seemed prudent given the stakes. The irony is profound. A system designed to maintain order created perpetual anxiety. A religion meant to provide stability generated constant fear. The very concept that was supposed to protect Egyptians from chaos became a source of psychological chaos itself. Therefore, when we examine the brutal religious reforms that followed, we must understand they weren't just attacking spiritual beliefs. They were demolishing the entire psychological architecture that made daily life bearable. The farmer Keti we imagined earlier didn't just lose his religion when reforms came. He lost his understanding of how reality itself functioned. Without Ma'at, without cosmic order, without the familiar gods who had supposedly kept chaos at bay, what prevented the world from dissolving into primordial darkness? This is why religious reforms in ancient Egypt were so uniquely traumatic. They didn't just change what people believed, they shattered their fundamental understanding of how existence itself operated. And as we'll discover, when pharaohs decided to play with these cosmic forces, the human cost was beyond anything they could have imagined. Because destroying someone's understanding of reality is perhaps the cruelest form of violence, one that echoes through generations like ripples from a stone thrown into the sacred waters of the Nile. Now imagine that farmer Keti, waking up to discover his cosmic nightmare had become reality. The year is 1353 BC, and Pharaoh Amenhotep IV has just declared war on the gods themselves. Picture the most radical religious leader you can imagine. Now multiply that by the power of absolute monarchy, add the divine authority of godhood, and you begin to approach the sheer audacity of what this pharaoh attempted. But Amenhotep IV wasn't content with merely reforming religion. He decided to delete Egypt's entire pantheon and replace it with a single deity, the Aten, a sun disk that had previously been about as important as a backup dancer in the cosmic hierarchy. This wasn't gradual theological evolution. This was spiritual shock therapy on a civilizational scale. Therefore, when he changed his name to Akhenaten, meaning beneficial to the Aten, he wasn't just rebranding himself. He was announcing the death of 3,000 years of Egyptian religious tradition. The mainstream historical fact is staggering. Akhenaten closed temples throughout Egypt, dismissed thousands of priests, and redirected their massive wealth to his new capital at Amarna. It was like a corporate takeover, except the corporation was reality itself. But here's where the story becomes truly remarkable and remarkably brutal. Akhenaten didn't just change what God's people worshipped. He fundamentally altered how Egyptians could relate to the divine. Under the old system, you could pray directly to Isis for healing, appeal to Thoth for wisdom, or ask Sobek for protection from crocodiles. It was like having a divine customer service department with specialized representatives for every conceivable problem. Therefore, when Akhenaten declared that only he could communicate with the Aten, he essentially cut off millions of people from their personal relationships with the divine. Imagine if tomorrow, someone announced that you could only speak to God through one specific intermediary who lived in a desert palace, and that intermediary happened to be the person making this rule. The psychological impact was devastating. Egyptian workers who had prayed to Ptah for strength during labor suddenly found themselves spiritually unemployed. Mothers who had sought Tawaret's protection during childbirth faced pregnancy without divine assistance. Farmers who had relied on Hapi to bring the Nile's flood discovered their cosmic insurance policies had been cancelled without notice. Akhenaten's revolution created what we might recognize as history's first recorded case of mass spiritual identity crisis. People who had grown up believing in cosmic balance through diverse divine relationships suddenly found themselves in a theological monarchy, divine autocracy, with a sun disk logo. The quirky archaeological evidence reveals just how thorough this transformation attempted to be. Workers systematically chiseled the names and images of traditional gods from monument walls throughout Egypt, like ancient cancel culture, with hammers and chisels. Some missed spots suggest the work was either rushed or performed by people who secretly disagreed with the project. Ancient Egypt's first recorded instances of workplace passive resistance. But the human cost extended far beyond wounded religious feelings. Akhenaten's reforms devastated Egypt's economy and social structure in ways that would make modern economists weep. Consider the Temple of Amun at Karnak, which had employed thousands of people: priests, scribes, craftsmen, farmers, guards, cleaners, musicians, dancers, and countless others whose livelihoods depended on religious observance. When Akhenaten closed these temples, he didn't just eliminate jobs, he destroyed entire communities that had organized around religious service for generations. It was like Amazon suddenly deciding to shut down all warehouses while simultaneously banning online shopping. The economic disruption rippled through society with devastating effect. Therefore, when families who had served temple communities for generations suddenly found themselves unemployed and spiritually homeless, the social fabric began to fray in ways that went far beyond religious disagreement. Akhenaten built his new capital, Amarna, in the middle of nowhere. Imagine if a modern leader decided to move the national capital to a completely empty desert and required the entire government to relocate there. The logistics alone were staggering, requiring massive resources during a time when traditional economic structures were collapsing. The new city was designed around Aten worship, with open-air temples that reflected the sun disk's light-based theology. But this architectural innovation created practical problems for people accustomed to the mysterious, lamp-lit sanctuaries of traditional temples. Worshipping in blazing sunlight proved less spiritually inspiring than the reformers had anticipated. Apparently, the gods prefer mood lighting for a reason. Workers at Amarna faced unique challenges. They had to construct a capital city while learning entirely new religious protocols, like building a skyscraper while someone constantly changes the blueprints. Archaeological evidence suggests construction quality suffered as confused workers struggled to implement unfamiliar religious architectural requirements. But perhaps most cruelly, Akhenaten's reforms criminalized the religious practices that had provided comfort during life's hardships. Grieving parents could no longer pray to Osiris for their deceased children's safe passage to the afterlife. The sick could no longer seek healing from Sekhmet. The desperate could no longer appeal to Isis for protection from life's countless dangers. Historians still argue whether Akhenaten was a visionary monotheist ahead of his time, or a megalomaniac who used religious reform to consolidate political power. The truth probably contains elements of both, Revolutionary leaders often blend genuine conviction with opportunistic power grabbing in ways that are difficult to separate, even with hindsight. Therefore, ordinary Egyptians found themselves caught between their spiritual needs and their political survival. Practicing traditional religion became an act of treason, but abandoning it felt like cosmic suicide. The psychological pressure was enormous. People had to publicly embrace a new god while privately grieving the loss of deities who had been like family members. Imagine being forced to pretend your parents never existed while enthusiastically praising your new adoptive father, who happens to be a glowing disk in the sky that doesn't speak directly to anyone except the pharaoh. Some communities developed what we might call spiritual code switching, publicly praising the Aten while privately maintaining traditional practices. Archaeological evidence from Amarna worker villages suggests people kept small traditional religious objects hidden in their homes, like spiritual contraband, that could cost them their lives if discovered. The isolation of Amarna compounded these problems. Cut off from traditional religious centers, people couldn't even visit the graves of their ancestors without undertaking dangerous journeys to abandoned temple complexes. Death rituals, which had provided crucial psychological comfort for millennia, became legally problematic when they involved traditional gods. Women suffered particular hardships during this transition. Many had served as priestesses in traditional temples, roles that provided both spiritual fulfillment and economic independence. Akhenaten's reforms largely eliminated these positions, forcing women into domestic roles without the religious authority they had previously enjoyed. The education system collapsed alongside religious institutions. Traditional schools had been temple-based, with priests teaching reading, writing, and mathematics alongside religious instruction. When temples closed, children's access to education vanished overnight. Imagine if every school in the country suddenly shut down because they taught the wrong subject matter. Therefore, an entire generation grew up with limited literacy skills and no connection to their cultural heritage, creating a knowledge gap that would haunt Egypt for decades. The agricultural calendar, which had been organized around religious festivals for thousands of years, became problematic when those festivals were banned. Farmers who had timed planting and harvesting around religious celebrations suddenly had to navigate agricultural cycles without their traditional markers, like trying to cook without a recipe or tell time without a clock. But perhaps the most telling evidence of this reform's brutality lies in what happened next. When Akhenaten died after 17 years of revolutionary rule, the reaction was swift and merciless. His successors didn't just reverse his policies, they tried to erase him from history entirely. The speed and thoroughness of this counter-revolution suggests that Akhenaten's reforms had created such profound trauma that Egypt collectively decided to pretend they had never happened. It was like national-scale therapeutic amnesia, except the patient was an entire civilization. As we drift deeper into this ancient trauma, remember that every statue defaced, every temple closed, every traditional prayer criminalized represented a human life disrupted, a family torn apart, a community destroyed. Because in the end, the first great religious revolution in recorded history proved one timeless truth. When gods go to war, mortals always pay the price in blood, tears, and shattered faith. Picture the moment when 17 years of revolutionary terror finally ended. Akhenaten is dead. His strange capital at Amarna suddenly feels like a ghost town, and across Egypt, traditional priests emerge from hiding like survivors of a theological apocalypse. But their emergence wasn't peaceful restoration. It was revenge with religious fervor and political calculation combined into something far more dangerous than either alone. The counter-revolution began before Akhenaten's body had finished mummifying. Traditional priests, who had spent nearly 2 decades in exile or underground, didn't just want their old jobs back, they wanted blood. Therefore, Egypt embarked on what might be history's first systematic campaign of religious historical erasure, a project so thorough it would make modern dictators take notes. The speed was breathtaking. Within months of Akhenaten's death, workers were chiseling his name from monuments with the efficiency of ancient search and replace functions. Every cartouche bearing his name, every reference to the Aten's supremacy, every trace of his revolutionary theology, systematically destroyed. But this wasn't just about removing offensive graffiti. The Egyptians believed that destroying someone's name could kill them in the afterlife. Spiritual murder by chisel and hammer. The mainstream historical fact is staggering. Archaeologists estimate that over 90% of Akhenaten's monuments were deliberately destroyed or defaced during this counter-revolution. It was like trying to delete someone from the internet, except the internet was carved in stone and the delete button was a mob with hammers. Therefore, when traditional priests regained power, they didn't just restore the old gods, they declared war on anyone who had collaborated with the heretic pharaoh. The purges began systematically. Former Aten priests faced impossible choices: publicly renounce their beliefs and hope for mercy, or maintain their convictions and face execution. Most chose survival, creating what we might recognize as Egypt's first recorded mass conversion under duress. But public renunciation wasn't enough. The traditional priesthood demanded proof of loyalty through active participation in destroying Akhenaten's legacy. Former Aten worshippers were required to help demolish the very temples they had once served. Imagine being forced to burn down your childhood home while your neighbors watched to ensure your enthusiasm was genuine. The psychological warfare was sophisticated and cruel. Families were encouraged to denounce relatives who had served in Akhenaten's administration. Children were rewarded for reporting parents who whispered prayers to the Aten. It was like ancient Egypt's version of the Cultural Revolution, complete with public confessions and forced self-criticism. The quirky archaeological evidence reveals the personal nature of this revenge. In some cases, workers didn't just deface Akhenaten's images, they specifically targeted his eyes and mouth, the features that would be needed for sight and speech in the afterlife. This wasn't random vandalism, it was deliberate spiritual assault designed to ensure the heretic pharaoh would be blind and mute for eternity. Akhenaten's capital, at Amarna, became a particularly grim symbol of the counter-revolution's thoroughness. The city that had been built as a testament to revolutionary theology was systematically dismantled, its stones recycled for traditional temple construction. It was like taking apart a cathedral to build a rival church, except the cathedral's congregation might still be living in the rubble. But the human cost extended far beyond elite persecution. Ordinary people who had worked at Amarna, craftsmen, farmers, servants, guards, suddenly found themselves associated with history's greatest heresy. Their employment history had become a spiritual crime. Many Amarna workers faced a cruel dilemma: return to their original communities where they'd be suspect, or remain in the abandoned capital where economic opportunities had vanished. Archaeological evidence suggests some chose to stay, creating small settlements among the ruins like refugees camping in their former workplace. Therefore, entire families were forced to create new identities, abandoning their recent past like witnesses entering protection programs. Children who had grown up worshipping the Aten had to learn traditional prayers quickly, or face social ostracism and potential violence. The restoration wasn't just religious, it was economic warfare. Traditional temples reclaimed their confiscated land and wealth, but they also demanded compensation for their 17 years of losses. This created crushing financial pressure on communities that had benefited from Akhenaten's reforms, like retroactive taxation on heresy. Historians still argue whether the counter-revolution's violence was spontaneous popular uprising or carefully orchestrated political campaign. The truth probably involves elements of both: genuine religious outrage manipulated by priests who had spent years planning their revenge. The paranoia was contagious. People began destroying their own Aten-related possessions preemptively, hoping to avoid association with the forbidden religion. Archaeologists have found broken Aten amulets buried in household garbage pits, like spiritual contraband disposed of in panic. Women who had served as Aten priestesses faced particular persecution. The traditional priesthood viewed their religious authority as both heretical and improper, making them targets for both theological and gender-based retaliation. Many were forced into domestic servitude or worse fates, becoming religious refugees in their own land. The educational system underwent equally brutal transformation. Teachers who had instructed children in Aten theology were dismissed or retrained, forced to publicly repudiate their former lessons. Imagine teachers being required to tell their students that everything they'd learned was not just wrong, but spiritually dangerous. Educational gaslighting on a societal scale. But perhaps most insidiously, the counter-revolution created a climate where questioning any aspect of traditional religion became dangerous. The trauma of Akhenaten's revolution made Egyptians hypersensitive to religious deviation, creating an orthodoxy more rigid than anything that had existed before the heresy. Therefore, the attempt to restore religious stability actually created a more oppressive spiritual environment than had existed prior to Akhenaten's reforms. The speed of historical revision was remarkable. Within a generation, Akhenaten had been transformed from a revolutionary pharaoh into a cautionary tale about the dangers of religious innovation. Official histories portrayed his reign as a time of chaos and divine displeasure, conveniently omitting the fact that many of his reforms had addressed genuine problems within the traditional system. Children who had lived through the Aten period learned to speak of it only in whispers, if at all. Parents who had once praised the sun disk's light now told their children stories about the terrible time when Egypt had forgotten its true gods, collective amnesia as survival strategy. The restoration's thoroughness extended to architectural details. Workers didn't just restore traditional temples, they added new sections designed to glorify the god's triumph over the Aten heresy. It was like building victory monuments over your enemy's grave, except the enemy had once been your pharaoh. Some communities developed rituals of purification designed to cleanse themselves of Aten contamination. These ceremonies involved public prayers, renouncing the sun disk and reaffirming loyalty to traditional deities, spiritual shower ceremonies for theological sins. The counter-revolution's success was so complete that Akhenaten virtually disappeared from Egyptian records. Later pharaohs referred to him only as the enemy or the criminal of Amarna, like Voldemort in ancient Egypt, the pharaoh whose name must not be spoken. But this erasure came at a cost that Egypt would carry for generations. The trauma of revolution and counter-revolution created a society perpetually afraid of religious change, where innovation became synonymous with heresy and spiritual exploration meant potential death. The message was clear: challenge the gods at your peril, because when they return to power, their vengeance will be swift, thorough, and eternal. And as we'll discover, this pattern of religious violence and counter-violence would echo through Egyptian history like a curse that even the gods themselves couldn't break. Now that we've witnessed the brutal cycle of religious revolution and counter-revolution, imagine discovering that behind all this spiritual warfare lay something far more mundane: money, land, and economic control on a scale that would make modern corporations envious. Picture the Temple of Amun at Karnak, not as a house of worship, but as ancient Egypt's equivalent of Amazon, Walmart, and Goldman Sachs rolled into one massive conglomerate that happened to worship a ram-headed god. But this wasn't just a religious institution with some business interests. Egyptian temples were economic empires that controlled vast territories, employed hundreds of thousands of workers, and wielded financial power that could make or break entire regions. The mainstream historical fact is staggering. By the New Kingdom period, Egyptian temples collectively owned roughly 1/3 of all cultivable land in Egypt and employed nearly 20% of the population. Imagine if churches today controlled 1/3 of all farmland and employed 1 in 5 workers. The economic leverage would be unimaginable. Therefore, when pharaohs initiated religious reforms, they weren't just changing spiritual practices. They were essentially attempting hostile takeovers of Egypt's largest corporations, which happened to have gods as their CEOs. The Temple of Amun alone owned over 700,000 head of cattle, 453,000 pieces of land, and received annual tribute that included 309,950 sacks of grain. It was like a medieval agribusiness empire with a religious marketing department, except the marketing department claimed direct communication with divine management. But here's where the brutality becomes clear. These temple economies didn't just provide employment. They created economic dependency so complete that challenging religious authority meant economic suicide for entire communities. Consider a typical farming family near Thebes. Their land technically belonged to the Temple of Amun. Their tools were temple property. Their seed grain came from temple stores, and their harvest quotas were set by temple administrators. They weren't just economically dependent, they were essentially sharecroppers for the gods. Except the gods had very demanding earthly representatives. Therefore, when religious reforms threatened temple power, ordinary families faced losing not just their spiritual beliefs but their homes, livelihoods, and entire way of life. The temple tribute system was particularly ingenious in its cruelty. Farmers were required to provide specific percentages of their crops to support temple operations: grain for bread, barley for beer, flax for linen, animals for sacrifice. It was like taxation, except the tax collectors claimed divine authority, and the penalties for non-payment included both earthly punishment and eternal damnation. Women who worked in temple workshops faced unique forms of economic coercion. Temple priestesses and female workers were often provided housing, food, and protection in exchange for their service, creating arrangements that resembled modern employment contracts crossed with religious vows. But leaving temple service meant losing both spiritual community and economic security, like quitting a job that's also your religion, your social network, and your retirement plan. The quirky archaeological evidence reveals just how sophisticated these temple economies had become. Papyrus records from the Temple of Amun show detailed inventory management systems that tracked everything from sacred golden vessels to donkey dung used for fertilizer. They had accountants for the gods, celestial bookkeeping with hieroglyphic spreadsheets. But the real brutality lay in how temple priests used economic pressure to enforce religious compliance. Families who questioned temple authority might find their land reassigned, their tribute quotas increased, or their access to temple services restricted. It was spiritual extortion with financial leverage: believe correctly or face economic ruin. Temple construction projects became particularly effective tools for economic control. When pharaohs ordered new temples or renovations, local communities were required to provide both materials and labor. This wasn't voluntary civic participation, it was mandatory economic service disguised as religious devotion, like being conscripted to build your own prison. The temple workshop system created another layer of economic dependency. Craftsmen who worked in temple complexes, metalworkers, carpenters, weavers, jewelers, often lived in temple-controlled housing and received their materials from temple stores. Their entire professional identity was tied to religious institutions, making any challenge to temple authority a career-ending decision. Therefore, when Akhenaten attempted to redirect temple wealth to his new Aten cult, he wasn't just changing religious practices, he was dismantling the economic foundation that supported hundreds of thousands of Egyptian families. Historians still argue whether Egyptian priests genuinely believed in their divine mission or cynically exploited religious authority for economic gain. The truth probably varies by individual and era, but the economic incentives for maintaining religious power were undeniably massive. The temple rental system added another dimension to this economic control. Many Egyptian families lived on temple-owned land and paid rent through agricultural labor or crop shares. Challenging religious authority could result in eviction, leaving families homeless and economically destitute. It was like having your landlord also be your spiritual advisor and your boss, a triple threat of dependency. Temple festivals, which provided rare entertainment and social gathering opportunities for ordinary Egyptians, also served economic functions. These celebrations required massive expenditures for food, drink, decorations, and entertainment, creating temporary employment for musicians, dancers, cooks, and craftsmen. But this economic boost came with religious strings attached. Communities that failed to properly celebrate temple festivals might find their economic opportunities diminished. The temple banking system was particularly sophisticated. Wealthy Egyptians could deposit valuables in temple treasuries for safekeeping, and temples often provided loans for agricultural projects or business ventures. But these financial services came with religious obligations. Defaulting on a temple loan wasn't just a business failure. It was a spiritual transgression that could affect your standing in the afterlife. Women's economic roles within temple systems were especially complex. Some female workers achieved significant authority as temple administrators or skilled craftspeople, but their power was entirely dependent on maintaining religious orthodoxy. A female temple scribe who questioned religious doctrine might find herself demoted to cleaning duties or expelled entirely. Professional demotion with spiritual consequences. The temple taxation system extended beyond agricultural tribute to include specialized levies. Craftsmen were required to provide specific products: pottery for temple use, jewelry for religious ceremonies, weapons for temple guards. It was like a medieval subscription service for the gods, except cancellation wasn't an option, and the terms of service were written in hieroglyphs. But perhaps most insidiously, the temple economy created intergenerational dependency. Children who grew up in temple-controlled communities often had no knowledge of alternative economic arrangements. Their education, social connections, and professional training all centered around religious institutions, making it nearly impossible to imagine life outside temple control. The temple land redistribution policies provided another tool for economic manipulation. Priests could reward loyalty by granting better agricultural plots or punish dissent by reassigning families to less fertile land. It was like performance reviews with eternal consequences. Your annual evaluation included both work productivity and spiritual devotion. Therefore, when religious reforms threatened to dismantle these economic structures, the resistance wasn't just about theological conviction. It was about survival for hundreds of thousands of people whose entire lives were intertwined with temple economies. The restoration following Akhenaten's death involved not just rebuilding temples, but reconstructing entire economic networks that had supported traditional religious institutions. Communities that had been economically devastated by religious reforms needed years to recover their former stability, creating lasting resentment against any form of religious innovation. The psychological impact was profound. Egyptians learned that challenging religious authority didn't just risk divine displeasure, it threatened economic catastrophe for entire families and communities. This lesson created a society where economic security and religious orthodoxy became inseparable, making future religious reforms not just spiritually dangerous, but economically terrifying. As we drift deeper into this ancient world of economic and spiritual manipulation, remember that every temple offering, every religious tax, every mandatory festival contribution represented not just religious devotion, but economic coercion. A system where your paycheck and your prayers were controlled by the same hands, and questioning either could cost you everything you had worked to build in this life and whatever you hoped to achieve in the next. Economic control was devastating enough, but imagine living under a system where your spiritual overseers claimed the power to damn your soul for eternity and had detailed descriptions of exactly how that damnation would feel. Picture waking up each morning knowing that a single religious misstep could condemn you to have your heart devoured by a crocodile-headed demon, while your consciousness remained intact to experience every terrifying moment. This wasn't abstract theology. This was psychological warfare disguised as spiritual guidance. But Egyptian priests didn't just threaten vague divine displeasure. They developed sophisticated maps of supernatural torture, complete with specific punishments for specific religious transgressions, like a spiritual penal code written by cosmic sadists. The mainstream historical fact is chilling. Egyptian religious texts describe over 40 different forms of punishment awaiting the impious in the afterlife, ranging from being turned upside down and forced to eat excrement to having one's soul repeatedly destroyed and reborn in endless cycles of agony. Therefore, when priests threatened divine retribution for religious disobedience, they weren't making empty threats. They were describing detailed scenarios that terrified people into compliance through sheer psychological terror. The Book of the Dead reads like a survival manual for navigating supernatural minefields. Chapter 125 alone lists 42 specific sins that could result in eternal damnation, from obvious crimes like murder to seemingly innocuous acts like disturbing water or increasing your voice. It was like having a cosmic terms of service agreement written by paranoid lawyers, except violating the fine print meant eternal torment instead of account suspension. But the real genius of this system lay in how it made every aspect of daily life potentially dangerous. Priests could interpret any misfortune, illness, crop failure, family disputes, as evidence of divine displeasure, creating a climate where people lived in constant fear of supernatural punishment. Consider the psychological impact on an ordinary Egyptian farmer. Every morning, he had to perform specific prayers correctly or risk divine wrath. Every interaction with neighbors could be interpreted as religiously significant. Every natural disaster in his community might be blamed on his insufficient piety. It was like living under surveillance by invisible, all-powerful beings who kept meticulous records of your spiritual transgressions. The afterlife judgment process, as described by priests, was particularly terrifying. The deceased's heart would be weighed against the feather of Ma'at, while 42 divine assessors judged their worthiness. If found wanting, the person's heart would be devoured by Amit, part crocodile, part lion, part hippopotamus, and their soul would cease to exist entirely. It was like the ultimate performance review, except failure meant complete annihilation rather than a poor recommendation letter. Therefore, Egyptians developed elaborate strategies for avoiding divine punishment, creating a spiritual insurance industry where priests sold protective spells, amulets, and burial preparations to help people navigate the supernatural bureaucracy of the afterlife. The quirky archaeological evidence reveals just how seriously Egyptians took these threats. Some mummies have been found with over 400 protective amulets placed throughout their wrappings, like spiritual armor against cosmic prosecution. One particularly anxious individual from the Ptolemaic period was buried with 7 different copies of the Book of the Dead, apparently believing that multiple copies would provide better protection, the ancient equivalent of backing up your files to multiple cloud servers. Women faced unique psychological pressures within this system of divine surveillance. Female deities like Sekhmet were portrayed as particularly vengeful toward women who violated religious or social norms, creating gender-specific fears about divine punishment. Mothers worried that their children's misbehavior might reflect their own spiritual failures, adding maternal guilt to their existing religious anxiety. The priesthood reinforced these fears through strategic interpretation of natural events. When earthquakes struck, priests explained them as divine anger over religious negligence. When diseases spread, they were attributed to community spiritual failures. When the Nile's flood was inadequate, it was blamed on insufficient temple offerings. It was like having meteorologists who explained weather patterns through moral judgment, except these explanations carried eternal consequences. Historians still argue whether Egyptian priests genuinely believed in the literal reality of these supernatural punishments, or cynically manipulated popular fears for social control. The truth probably varies by individual and period, but the psychological impact on ordinary Egyptians was undeniably severe regardless of priestly motivations. But perhaps most insidiously, this system created communities where neighbors monitored each other's religious behavior. People reported suspicious spiritual practices to local priests, creating networks of religious surveillance that would make modern authoritarian regimes envious. It was like having a cosmic neighborhood watch program where everyone was both observer and potential target. The economic implications were staggering. Families spent enormous portions of their income on protective religious services, special prayers, blessed amulets, elaborate burial preparations. The fear of divine punishment created a massive market for spiritual protection services, with priests essentially selling insurance policies against supernatural prosecution. Therefore, challenging religious authority meant not just risking economic hardship and social ostracism, but potentially condemning yourself and your family to eternal torture, described in horrifying detail by the same authorities you were questioning. Children absorbed these fears from infancy, creating generational trauma that perpetuated the system. Young Egyptians learned that invisible divine beings watched their every action, recorded their every transgression, and would judge them with supernatural powers that made earthly authorities seem benevolent by comparison. The specific punishments described in religious texts were designed to target fundamental human fears: being buried alive, burned repeatedly, having limbs torn off and regenerated for fresh torture. These weren't random cruelties, but calculated psychological weapons aimed at the deepest anxieties of human consciousness. Some religious texts describe punishments that continue for millions of years, numbers so large they exceed human comprehension. It was like threatening someone with a prison sentence measured in geological timescales, punishments so extensive it becomes meaningless except as pure terror. The portable nature of these threats made them particularly effective. Unlike earthly authorities who could only punish you within their territory, divine surveillance followed Egyptians everywhere. You couldn't escape to another city or change your identity. The gods would find you, judge you, and punish you according to cosmic laws that made human justice seem merciful and rational. Therefore, when religious reforms threatened to change these spiritual rules, people faced the terrifying possibility that their lifetime of careful religious observance might suddenly become worthless, or worse, might be reinterpreted as evidence of heretical belief, worthy of the very punishments they had spent their lives trying to avoid. The psychological legacy of this system lasted far beyond individual lifetimes. Entire communities developed collective neuroses around religious performance, creating cultures where spiritual anxiety was passed down through generations like inherited trauma. Because in ancient Egypt, the most effective way to control people wasn't through visible force. It was through invisible terrors that followed them from cradle to grave and beyond into whatever cosmic judgment awaited in the shadows of eternity. While men feared divine judgment and economic ruin, imagine being responsible for your family's spiritual safety while having no control over the religious rules that changed without warning. This was the impossible position of women during Egypt's religious upheavals. Picture a mother named Nefertiti, not the famous queen, just an ordinary woman with an unfortunate name during politically dangerous times. She's teaching her 5-year-old daughter morning prayers to Isis, when soldiers arrive announcing that yesterday's devotions are now tomorrow's death sentences. But women couldn't simply abandon their spiritual responsibilities when religions changed. They remained accountable for their family's cosmic welfare while navigating theological landmines that shifted daily. The mainstream historical fact is striking. Women comprised roughly 60% of temple workers in ancient Egypt, serving as musicians, dancers, weavers, and priestesses. When religious reforms swept through Egypt, these women didn't just lose jobs. They lost their entire social identity and economic independence. Therefore, religious upheavals hit women with triple impact: spiritual confusion, economic devastation, and the impossible burden of maintaining family religious obligations in an environment where religious practice had become legally dangerous. Female priestesses faced particularly cruel dilemmas during religious transitions. Take the gods' wives of Amun, powerful religious figures who had wielded significant authority and controlled vast temple resources. When Akhenaten banned traditional worship, these women found themselves transformed overnight from respected spiritual leaders into enemies of the state, like CEOs discovering their companies had been declared illegal while they slept. But the cruelty extended beyond elite women to ordinary mothers throughout Egypt. Women who had taught their children traditional prayers suddenly faced the terrifying choice: continue spiritual education and risk their family's safety, or abandon religious instruction and potentially damn their children's souls according to the beliefs they'd held their entire lives. Consider the psychological torture of this position. Egyptian mothers believed their primary responsibility was ensuring their children's successful passage to the afterlife through proper religious instruction. When that instruction became illegal, mothers were forced to choose between their children's earthly safety and their eternal salvation. Sophie's choice with cosmic consequences. The household shrine system created additional burdens for women during religious upheavals. Egyptian homes typically contained small shrines where women performed daily devotions, made offerings, and sought divine protection for their families. When religions changed, these shrines became evidence of heretical belief that could endanger the entire household. Therefore, women became responsible for the emotionally devastating task of destroying the sacred objects that had provided spiritual comfort for themselves and their families, dismantling their own spiritual support systems to protect their loved ones from persecution. The quirky archaeological evidence reveals the creative desperation of women during these transitions. Excavations have uncovered household shrines where traditional god statues were carefully buried in courtyard gardens rather than destroyed, suggesting women created spiritual time capsules, hoping to preserve their beliefs until safer times returned. It was like hiding family photos of relatives who had become politically dangerous, except the relatives were gods. Children bore unique trauma during religious upheavals, and mothers carried the burden of managing that trauma while dealing with their own spiritual crisis. Young Egyptians who had learned to pray to specific deities for protection during nightmares, illness, or fear suddenly found those protective figures declared evil or non-existent. Imagine explaining to a terrified child that the goddess Taweret, who had protected them since birth, was now forbidden, while simultaneously trying to teach them new prayers to unfamiliar deities, whose protection you weren't entirely convinced would be effective. It was like being required to tell your children that their imaginary friends were actually demons, while introducing them to new imaginary friends you didn't trust. The educational disruption particularly affected girls, who traditionally learned religious responsibilities from their mothers through direct participation in household spiritual practices. When those practices became illegal, mothers couldn't teach daughters the skills they would need as future wives and mothers, creating a generational knowledge gap that would haunt families for decades. Women who served in temple workshops faced especially harsh economic consequences during religious reforms. Female weavers, perfume makers, bread bakers, and craftspeople who had worked in temple complexes found themselves not just unemployed, but unemployable, as their skills were associated with forbidden religious practices. It was like being a specialized worker whose entire industry had been declared criminal. Imagine being a social media manager during a revolution that banned the internet. But perhaps most cruelly, women often became scapegoats during religious transitions. When communities needed to demonstrate their rejection of forbidden beliefs, they frequently targeted women who had been prominent in traditional religious activities, making them symbolic sacrifices to prove collective loyalty to new spiritual authorities. Therefore, women learned to hide their religious knowledge even more carefully than men, as their spiritual expertise made them particularly vulnerable to accusations of maintaining forbidden practices. The marriage system created additional complications for women during religious upheavals. Egyptian marriage contracts often included religious obligations and spiritual responsibilities that became problematic when religions changed. Women might find themselves bound by marital vows to perform rituals that had become illegal, or married to men whose religious loyalties differed from the current political requirements. Historians still argue whether women's traditional roles as household religious managers made them more or less vulnerable during religious reforms. Some evidence suggests their private spiritual authority provided protection through obscurity, while other sources indicate their religious prominence made them prime targets for persecution. Pregnancy and childbirth presented particular challenges for women during religious transitions. Egyptian women traditionally relied on specific goddesses like Taweret and Bes for protection during labor, using prayers and amulets that might become forbidden during religious reforms. Imagine facing childbirth, already dangerous in ancient times, without access to the spiritual protections your mother and grandmother had relied upon. The wet nurse system added another layer of complexity. Women who served as wet nurses for wealthy families were expected to provide not just physical nourishment, but spiritual guidance for the children in their care. When religions changed, these women faced impossible choices about what religious knowledge to share, potentially endangering both their charges and themselves. Some women developed what we might recognize as religious code switching, maintaining different spiritual practices for different audiences. They might perform Akhenaten worship publicly while secretly teaching their daughters traditional prayers, creating complex double lives that required constant vigilance and emotional compartmentalization. The widow protection system, which had traditionally been managed through temple networks, collapsed during religious upheavals, leaving elderly women particularly vulnerable. Women who had expected temple support in their old age found themselves economically and socially abandoned when religious institutions were dismantled or transformed. Therefore, when we examine the human cost of religious reforms in ancient Egypt, we must recognize that women and children didn't just experience these changes. They absorbed the deepest trauma while carrying responsibility for their family's spiritual welfare in an environment where caring for souls had become a crime punishable by the very damnation they sought to prevent. While mothers struggled to protect their children's souls in private, the men who had publicly dedicated their lives to serving the gods faced a far more immediate and brutal reckoning: mass execution disguised as religious purification. Picture the great temple of Amun at Karnak in the months following Akhenaten's rise to power. Priests who had served faithfully for decades huddle in the sacred chambers where they once performed elaborate rituals, now hiding like refugees in their own temple as soldiers march through the corridors with execution lists bearing familiar names. But these weren't random killings driven by mob violence. These were systematic purges, orchestrated with bureaucratic precision, complete with proper documentation, religious justification, and efficient disposal methods that would have impressed modern authoritarian regimes. The mainstream historical fact is chilling. Archaeological evidence and papyrus records suggest that during Akhenaten's religious revolution, approximately 2,000 traditional priests were executed, with thousands more forced into exile or hiding. This represents the elimination of nearly the entire traditional priesthood in Upper Egypt within a single generation. Therefore, when Akhenaten declared his monotheistic revolution, he wasn't just changing religious policy. He was implementing what we might recognize today as systematic genocide, disguised as theological reform. The execution process revealed the calculated nature of this religious cleansing. Priests weren't simply killed, they were stripped of their sacred titles, had their names chiseled from temple records, and were denied proper burial rites. It was like deleting someone from existence with extreme prejudice, ensuring they would face spiritual as well as physical death. But the brutality escalated when Akhenaten's successors reversed his reforms. The traditional priesthood that regained power didn't just restore the old gods. They orchestrated revenge purges that made Akhenaten's original persecution look restrained by comparison. Consider the fate of Ai, a high priest of the Aten who had served Akhenaten faithfully. When traditional religion was restored, Ai faced a choice between publicly renouncing his beliefs and accepting execution. He chose to maintain his convictions, and the restored Amun priesthood made his death a public spectacle designed to terrorize any remaining Aten sympathizers. The execution methods were carefully chosen for maximum psychological impact. Priests convicted of heretical belief were often forced to destroy the religious artifacts they had once consecrated before facing death themselves. Imagine being required to burn your life's work before being killed for having done that work, like making an author torch their books before facing execution for literacy. Therefore, these weren't just executions. They were elaborate rituals of spiritual humiliation designed to demonstrate the complete victory of one religious system over another. The family destruction policies added another layer of cruelty to these purges. Priestly families were often executed together to eliminate any possibility of religious knowledge surviving through bloodlines. Children who had grown up learning sacred rituals were killed alongside their fathers, ensuring that entire generations of religious tradition died with their practitioners. Women married to condemned priests faced particularly cruel choices. They could attempt to save themselves and their children by publicly renouncing their husbands and converting to the approved religion, or they could maintain family loyalty and face execution alongside their loved ones. It was like being forced to choose between betraying your family and protecting your children, an impossible moral calculus with fatal consequences either way. The quirky, yet horrifying archaeological evidence reveals the systematic nature of these purges. Mass graves near former temple complexes contain skeletal remains, showing evidence of ritualized execution. Multiple bodies with similar wound patterns, suggesting organized killing rather than chaotic violence. One site near Hermopolis contains over 300 skeletons, many with their hands bound, arranged in patterns that suggest ceremonial mass execution. It was like ancient Egypt's version of organized crime, except the crime was believing in the wrong gods. But perhaps most disturbing was how these purges created cycles of revenge that perpetuated religious violence for generations. Sons of executed priests grew up planning revenge against the religious authorities who had killed their fathers, creating blood feuds disguised as theological disputes. The public nature of many executions served multiple purposes beyond simple elimination of opposition. When priests were executed in temple courtyards, the killings desecrated the sacred spaces while demonstrating the powerlessness of the condemned men's gods to protect them. It was spiritual warfare using physical violence, proving theological superiority through superior killing capacity. Historians still argue whether these purges were driven by genuine religious conviction or opportunistic political calculation, but the psychological impact on Egyptian society was undeniably severe, regardless of the motivations behind them. The survivor networks that emerged from these purges created underground religious movements that would influence Egyptian spirituality for centuries. Priests who escaped execution often fled to remote areas where they maintained forbidden religious practices in secret, like spiritual resistance fighters preserving banned traditions in religious guerrilla warfare. Therefore, the attempt to eliminate opposing religious traditions through mass murder actually ensured their survival by creating martyrs and underground networks that proved more resilient than the original institutional structures. The documentation of these purges reveals the bureaucratic mindset behind the violence. Scribes kept detailed records of executed priests, including their religious ranks, family connections, and the specific charges against them. These administrative records read like personnel files for genocide, methodical tracking of systematic elimination disguised as religious housekeeping. Some purges targeted specific religious knowledge rather than just religious practitioners. Priests who specialized in particular rituals, astronomical calculations, or sacred texts were prioritized for elimination to ensure that certain religious practices would be impossible to restore. It was like targeting software engineers who knew specific programming languages, eliminating the knowledge by eliminating the knowledgeable. The economic motivations behind some purges became clear when examining the redistribution of temple wealth following executions. Priestly families' property was typically confiscated and redistributed to supporters of the winning religious faction, creating financial incentives for religious persecution that went far beyond theological conviction. Women who had served as priestesses faced unique forms of execution designed to humiliate their religious authority. Some were forced to perform degrading acts that violated their sacred vows before being killed, adding psychological torture to physical elimination. The symbolism was clear. Female religious authority was not just wrong, it was contemptible and worthy of degradation. But the most psychologically devastating aspect of these purges was how they forced surviving priests to participate in the execution of their colleagues. Priests who wanted to demonstrate their conversion to the approved religion were required to help kill their former associates, creating complicity that made later betrayal or resistance psychologically difficult. The timing of executions was often coordinated with religious festivals to maximize symbolic impact. Killing Amun priests during traditional Amun celebrations sent clear messages about the powerlessness of the old gods to protect their servants, while executing Aten priests during sun festivals demonstrated the triumph of traditional deities over the solar heresy. Therefore, these executions weren't just about eliminating opposition. They were elaborate theatrical productions designed to rewrite the spiritual landscape through spectacular violence. The international implications of these purges extended Egypt's religious violence beyond its borders. Foreign priests who had served in Egyptian temples were often executed alongside local clergy, creating diplomatic incidents that complicated Egypt's relationships with neighboring kingdoms. Religious persecution became a foreign policy tool that isolated Egypt from traditional allies. The children who witnessed these purges grew up with profound psychological trauma that shaped Egyptian society for generations. Young people learned that religious conviction was literally a matter of life and death, creating a society where spiritual belief became inseparable from political survival, and theological innovation meant potential suicide. The restoration periods following each purge created their own cycles of violence, as previously persecuted religious groups sought revenge against their former persecutors. Each religious transition brought new lists of enemies to eliminate, new property to redistribute, and new trauma to inflict on communities that had barely recovered from previous upheavals. As we contemplate these ancient cycles of religious violence, remember that every name chiseled from temple walls, every priestly family destroyed, every sacred text burned represented not just the elimination of opposition, but the creation of wounds that would fester through generations, proving that in the end, gods may be immortal, but the humans who serve them die very mortal deaths, and those deaths echo through eternity in ways their killers never imagined. While priests plotted revenge and executed each other with religious fervor, imagine being a simple pottery maker whose only crime was living in the wrong village when the gods went to war, and discovering that neutrality wasn't an option when dealing with cosmic conflicts. Picture the farming village of Hut Sechem during the religious upheavals of the late New Kingdom. Yesterday, they were proudly known for producing the finest grain in the region and maintaining a beautiful shrine to Sobek, the crocodile god who protected their irrigation canals. But today, soldiers arrive announcing that Sobek worship has been banned, the village shrine must be destroyed, and anyone who protests will be treated as an enemy of the pharaoh and the newly approved gods. The villagers face an impossible choice: resist and risk destruction, or comply and abandon the spiritual protections they believe keep their crops growing and their children safe from the Nile's crocodiles. Therefore, ordinary Egyptians discovered that religious wars weren't just theological debates among elites. They were existential threats that could destroy entire communities whose only mistake was backing the wrong cosmic team. The mainstream historical fact is sobering. Archaeological evidence suggests that during major religious transitions, approximately 40% of Egyptian villages experienced significant population displacement, with many communities completely abandoned as residents fled religious persecution or economic collapse caused by theological upheavals. But the cruelty toward common people went beyond simple displacement. Entire villages were often forced to demonstrate their conversion to new religious systems by participating in the destruction of their own sacred sites. Community members required to tear down the shrines where their ancestors had worshipped for generations. Consider the psychological trauma of being forced to smash the statue of Hathor that had protected your family's cattle for 3 generations, while soldiers watched to ensure your destruction was thorough enough to prove your sincerity. It was like being required to burn family photos to prove you'd forgotten your relatives, except the relatives were gods who might remember your betrayal for eternity. The agricultural workers bore particularly cruel burdens during religious transitions. Egyptian farming depended heavily on religious calendars that coordinated planting and harvesting with festival cycles and divine blessing ceremonies. When religions changed, farmers lost not just their spiritual practices, but their entire agricultural scheduling system. Therefore, communities faced the terrifying prospect of crop failure caused not by drought or disease, but by confusion about when to plant, according to new religious calendars that didn't align with traditional farming wisdom, accumulated over centuries. Village craftspeople suffered unique forms of persecution during religious upheavals. Artisans who had specialized in creating religious objects, amulets, shrine decorations, ceremonial vessels, suddenly found their skills criminalized. Imagine being a master goldsmith whose expertise in crafting Isis amulets became evidence of heretical belief rather than professional accomplishment. The quirky archaeological evidence reveals the desperate creativity of ordinary people trying to survive religious transitions. Excavations have uncovered conversion workshops, where craftsmen hastily modified traditional religious objects to conform to new theological requirements. Amun statues, with their heads replaced by Aten symbols. Shrine decorations with old god names chiseled out and new ones carved over them. It was like ancient Egypt's version of rebranding, except the brand was your eternal soul, and the marketing budget was your life. But perhaps most tragically, religious wars destroyed the community support networks that had sustained ordinary Egyptians through life's hardships. Village festivals that had provided rare entertainment, collective meals, and social bonding were often banned when associated with forbidden deities. Children who had grown up looking forward to annual celebrations dedicated to local gods suddenly found themselves in communities where joy itself had become suspect, and gathering for religious purposes could be interpreted as conspiracy against the state. It was like cancelling Christmas, Easter, and every birthday party simultaneously, except the cancellation came with threats of execution for anyone caught celebrating. The marketplace disruptions caused by religious upheavals created economic havoc for ordinary families. Merchants who had traded in religious goods, incense, oils, sacred texts, ceremonial foods, lost their livelihoods overnight when their products became contraband. Farmers who had sold produce for temple offerings found their primary customers eliminated by religious reform. Therefore, religious transitions created economic depressions that had nothing to do with natural disasters or foreign invasion, and everything to do with theological decisions made by rulers who never considered the practical consequences for ordinary people's survival. The forced labor conscription that accompanied major religious changes imposed additional hardships on common families. When pharaohs ordered the construction of new temples or the destruction of old ones, rural communities were required to provide workers for these projects, removing essential agricultural labor during critical farming seasons. Families watched their sons and fathers marched away to tear down the temples where they had been married, to build new shrines for gods they'd never heard of, while their fields went unplanted and their livestock went untended. It was like being drafted to demolish your own church while your crops rotted in the field. Civic duty that felt like cosmic betrayal. Women in rural communities faced unique challenges when religious authorities changed. Many villages had informal female religious leaders, older women who knew traditional prayers, healing rituals, and protective ceremonies. When religions changed, these women became dangerous sources of forbidden knowledge that could compromise entire communities. Villages faced painful choices: report their own grandmothers to religious authorities for practicing traditional healing, or risk collective punishment for harboring practitioners of forbidden spiritual arts. It was like being forced to choose between family loyalty and community survival, moral calculus that turned neighbors into informants and grandchildren into potential betrayers. Historians still argue whether common people's resistance to religious changes was driven by genuine spiritual conviction or practical concerns about disrupting established social and economic systems. But the suffering was undeniably real, regardless of the underlying motivations. The communication systems in rural Egypt made religious transitions particularly traumatic for ordinary people. Village communities often learned about major theological changes weeks or months after they had occurred, leaving them vulnerable to accusations of practicing now forbidden religions simply because they hadn't received updated information about cosmic policy changes. Imagine discovering that prayers you'd been saying for months were now capital offenses, not because you intended rebellion, but because news of religious reforms traveled slower than the soldiers sent to enforce them. It was like getting arrested for violating laws you'd never been told existed, legal liability for spiritual ignorance. But the most insidious damage to common people came through the destruction of oral traditions that had preserved community identity for generations. When village elders were forbidden to tell traditional stories associated with banned deities, entire cultural histories were lost within a single generation. Children grew up disconnected from their community's past, unable to understand the significance of local landmarks, seasonal celebrations, or family customs that had been intertwined with now forbidden religious practices. It was cultural amnesia imposed by theological decree, collective memory loss as religious policy. The migration patterns that resulted from religious persecution created refugee populations that strained resources in communities that had managed to avoid theological controversy. Villages that had successfully navigated religious transitions found themselves overwhelmed by displaced families, fleeing areas where their beliefs had become illegal. Therefore, even communities that had avoided direct religious persecution suffered indirect consequences as they struggled to accommodate refugees whose only crime had been worshipping gods who had fallen out of political favor. The intergenerational trauma created by these upheavals shaped Egyptian village life for centuries after specific religious conflicts ended. Grandparents who had survived religious purges taught their grandchildren to be suspicious of theological innovation, creating rural communities that were deeply conservative about spiritual matters and resistant to any form of religious change. The psychological legacy was profound. Ordinary Egyptians learned that the gods could not only fail to protect them, but could actually become sources of mortal danger if political winds shifted. This created a pragmatic approach to religion that prioritized survival over conviction, spiritual flexibility as life insurance in a world where yesterday's devotion could become tomorrow's death sentence. As we drift through these ancient villages caught between warring gods and competing pharaohs, remember that behind every grand religious revolution were countless ordinary people whose only desire was to tend their fields, raise their children, and honor the gods who had protected their families, until the day those gods became enemies and survival required forgetting everything they had ever believed about the sacred forces that governed their small corner of an increasingly dangerous world. While villages crumbled under the weight of divine warfare, imagine the ultimate sacrilege. Armies of workers systematically destroying the most beautiful art and architecture their civilization had ever created, wielding hammers and chisels against masterpieces that had taken generations to complete. Picture the great Temple of Amun at Karnak in 1350 BC. Master craftsmen who had spent their lives carving intricate hieroglyphs and painting divine scenes now stand before their own work, with destruction tools in hand, ordered to obliterate every trace of the gods they had once lovingly depicted. But this wasn't random vandalism driven by mob fury. This was calculated iconoclasm, executed with the same precision and artistry that had created the monuments in the first place. The mainstream historical fact is staggering. Modern archaeologists estimate that over 80% of Akhenaten's monuments were systematically destroyed during the counter-revolution, with stone blocks recycled for other building projects, essentially turning heretical temples into construction materials for orthodox religious buildings. Therefore, Egypt embarked on what might be history's first large-scale program of cultural destruction, disguised as religious purification, transforming artistic masterpieces into ideological rubble with bureaucratic efficiency. The destruction process revealed the deep Egyptian understanding of how images functioned spiritually. Workers didn't randomly smash statues, they systematically targeted specific features that Egyptians believed were necessary for divine power. Eyes, mouths, and hands were carefully chiseled away from god statues, ensuring the deities would be spiritually blinded, silenced, and paralyzed in the afterlife. But the cruelty extended beyond simply damaging divine images. The Egyptians believed that destroying a god's name or image could literally kill that deity, making this systematic vandalism a form of cosmic murder committed with artistic tools. Consider the psychological trauma inflicted on the craftsmen forced to destroy their own work. Master sculptors, who had spent decades perfecting their depictions of Amun's ram-headed form, were required to methodically deface their greatest achievements, while supervisors watched to ensure the destruction was thorough enough to demonstrate genuine conversion to the new religious order. It was like forcing Michelangelo to take a sledgehammer to the Sistine Chapel, while Vatican officials graded his enthusiasm for destruction. Artistic suicide as proof of theological loyalty. Therefore, these destruction campaigns didn't just eliminate religious art. They traumatized the artistic community and created a generation of craftsmen who learned that their life's work could become evidence of heresy overnight. The recycling programs that accompanied temple destruction added economic efficiency to spiritual warfare. When Akhenaten's temples were dismantled, the stone blocks were carefully catalogued and redistributed for use in traditional temple construction, creating building projects where heretical limestone literally formed the foundations of orthodox religious architecture. Archaeological excavations at Karnak have revealed foundation stones bearing Aten cartouches, buried beneath traditional Amun temple floors, like building a church on the bones of demolished rival congregations, except the congregation was a competing cosmic theology and the bones were actual architectural remains. The quirky archaeological evidence reveals the personal nature of some destruction. Certain statue defacements show tool marks consistent with emotional rather than systematic vandalism, deep gouges and repeated strikes that suggest workers were venting personal fury rather than following methodical destruction protocols. Some Amun priests apparently took out years of persecution on Aten statues with more enthusiasm than their supervisors had probably intended. But perhaps most disturbing was how the destruction campaigns created an entire industry of professional iconoclasts. Specialized work crews developed expertise in efficient monument destruction, traveling from site to site with portable toolkits designed for maximum vandalism effectiveness, like ancient Egypt's version of a demolition company, except they specialized in theological architecture and cosmic regime change. The papyrus documentation process that accompanied destruction campaigns reveals the bureaucratic mindset behind the cultural vandalism. Scribes kept detailed inventories of destroyed religious objects, including their original locations, materials, and the specific charges against the deities they depicted. These administrative records read like evidence catalogues for cosmic crimes, methodical documentation of divine murder disguised as religious housekeeping. Women who had worked as temple artists faced unique persecution during destruction campaigns. Female painters who had decorated shrine walls with traditional religious scenes were often forced to personally whitewash their own work before having it covered with new images depicting approved deities. Imagine being required to paint over your life's masterpiece while being told your artistic vision had been spiritually contaminated. Therefore, the destruction campaigns didn't just eliminate religious art, they transformed the artistic process itself into a tool of religious persecution, making creativity itself potentially dangerous depending on which gods you chose to depict. The public nature of many destruction ceremonies served psychological warfare purposes beyond simple iconoclasm. When god statues were publicly smashed in temple courtyards, the events functioned as demonstrations of divine powerlessness, proving that the old gods couldn't protect even their own images from destruction by the new religious authorities. Children who witnessed these destruction ceremonies absorbed traumatic lessons about the relationship between art, power, and survival. Young Egyptians learned that even the most beautiful and sacred creations could be destroyed overnight if they represented the wrong spiritual allegiances, artistic education that prioritized political safety over aesthetic achievement. Historians still argue whether the systematic nature of Egyptian iconoclasm was driven by genuine theological conviction or practical political calculation aimed at eliminating visual reminders of religious opposition. But the psychological impact on Egyptian culture was profound regardless of the underlying motivations. The specialized destruction techniques developed during these campaigns influenced Egyptian artistic practices for centuries afterward. Artists learned to create religious works that could be easily modified if theological winds changed. Images designed for theological flexibility rather than spiritual permanence. It was like building art with an uninstalled program already included. The international embarrassment caused by destruction campaigns damaged Egypt's relationships with neighboring kingdoms that had admired Egyptian artistic achievements. Foreign dignitaries who had visited magnificent temples returned to find empty courtyards and defaced monuments, creating diplomatic incidents that complicated trade relationships and cultural exchanges. But the most lasting damage came through the loss of artistic knowledge that was never recorded outside the destroyed works themselves. Many religious artistic techniques, color formulations, and iconographic traditions were preserved only in the monuments that were systematically destroyed, creating gaps in Egyptian artistic knowledge that would affect cultural development for generations. The reconstruction projects that followed destruction campaigns often failed to achieve the artistic quality of the original works they replaced. Craftsmen working under pressure to quickly produce orthodox religious art rarely matched the sophistication of the masterpieces they had been forced to destroy, creating a net loss in Egyptian artistic achievement that persisted long after the theological controversies had ended. Therefore, Egypt's religious wars didn't just change what God's people worshipped, they permanently diminished the civilization's artistic legacy by treating cultural masterpieces as expendable propaganda rather than eternal treasures worthy of preservation, regardless of their spiritual content. The psychological legacy was profound. Egyptian artists learned that their greatest achievements could become their greatest liabilities if political or religious circumstances changed. This created an artistic culture that prioritized survival over innovation, producing religious art designed more for theological safety than spiritual inspiration. Creativity constrained by the constant fear that today's masterpiece might become tomorrow's target for systematic destruction. As we contemplate these ancient scenes of cultural vandalism, remember that every chiseled face, every painted-over wall, every recycled stone block represented not just the destruction of art, but the murder of dreams, the calculated elimination of human creativity in service of cosmic politics that treated beauty as expendable and inspiration as potentially treasonous in a world where even the gods themselves could be sentenced to death by committee. Just when Egypt thought it had mastered the art of destroying its own religious traditions, foreign conquerors arrived with their own gods and their own very creative ideas about how to implement theological regime change on a civilization that was already traumatized by centuries of internal spiritual warfare. Picture Memphis in 525 BC as Persian armies marched through the streets, led by Cambyses II, who has just conquered the last independent pharaoh and now faces the delicate diplomatic challenge of managing a population that has already proven remarkably creative at religious violence when properly motivated. But Cambyses wasn't content with simply adding Egypt to his empire's tax rolls. He decided to demonstrate Persian superiority by personally executing the sacred Apis bull, the living god that Egyptians had worshipped for over 1,000 years. The mainstream historical fact is staggering. The Persian conquest of Egypt in 525 BC initiated nearly 200 years of foreign religious policies that systematically dismantled traditional Egyptian religious institutions while attempting to integrate selected elements into broader imperial administrative systems. Therefore, Egyptians who had survived generations of internal religious persecution now faced the additional challenge of navigating foreign theological requirements that often directly contradicted both traditional beliefs and recent religious innovations they had been forced to adopt. The Persian approach to Egyptian religion revealed sophisticated understanding of how to use spiritual control for imperial administration. Rather than simply banning Egyptian gods, Persian administrators selectively eliminated religious practices that might support political resistance, while preserving spiritual traditions that encouraged political submission. But this theological cherry-picking created psychological chaos for ordinary Egyptians who struggled to determine which aspects of their traditional beliefs were now safe to practice and which had become evidence of political disloyalty to foreign rulers, who claimed divine authority through completely different cosmic systems. Consider the fate of Egyptian temple schools during Persian rule. Traditional religious education was reformed to include Persian spiritual concepts and administrative training, creating a generation of Egyptian scribes who were fluent in theological systems that their grandparents would have considered heretical, but that had become necessary for economic survival under foreign occupation. It was like being required to learn a new operating system for your soul, while maintaining compatibility with legacy spiritual software that might crash the entire system if you made a mistake. Theological multitasking with eternal consequences. Therefore, Egyptian religious identity became increasingly fragmented as people learned to code switch between different spiritual systems, depending on their audience, their location, and the current political requirements of whichever authority happened to be in charge at any given moment. The Hyksos period, 1650 to 1550 BC, had provided an earlier preview of how foreign religious influence could traumatize Egyptian spiritual life. These Semitic rulers hadn't just conquered northern Egypt, they had introduced their own gods while attempting to co-opt Egyptian religious symbols for their own legitimacy, creating theological confusion that lasted for generations after their expulsion. The quirky archaeological evidence from this period reveals the creative desperation of Egyptians trying to navigate competing religious requirements. Excavations have uncovered household shrines containing Hyksos, traditional Egyptian, and hybrid deities, arranged in ways that suggest families were hedging their spiritual bets, maintaining multiple religious insurance policies to cover various possible cosmic scenarios. It was like having a diversified spiritual portfolio designed to minimize theological risk, regardless of which gods ended up winning the ultimate power struggle. Alexander's conquest in 332 BC brought Greek religious concepts that were simultaneously more and less compatible with Egyptian traditions than Persian spirituality had been. The Greeks were happy to identify their gods with Egyptian deities, Zeus with Amun, Dionysus with Osiris, but they also introduced philosophical concepts about divine nature that fundamentally challenged Egyptian understanding of how gods functioned. But the Ptolemaic synthesis that followed Alexander's death created perhaps the most psychologically complex religious environment in Egyptian history, as Greek rulers attempted to maintain legitimacy through Egyptian religious traditions while introducing Hellenistic spiritual concepts that often contradicted the theological foundations of the very traditions they claimed to respect. Egyptian priests found themselves in the impossible position of maintaining traditional rituals while incorporating foreign theological interpretations that fundamentally altered the meaning of ceremonies they had performed for centuries. Imagine being required to perform your wedding ceremony using traditional vows, but with completely different definitions of marriage that contradicted everything the ceremony was supposed to accomplish. Therefore, religious authenticity became increasingly difficult to define, as Egyptian spiritual practices evolved to accommodate successive waves of foreign influence that each claimed compatibility with traditional beliefs, while demanding fundamental changes to how those beliefs were understood and practiced. The Roman period, 30 BC, 641 AD, brought yet another layer of religious complexity as Egyptian gods became popular throughout the Mediterranean world, while simultaneously being suppressed or transformed within Egypt itself. Isis temples flourished in Rome, while traditional Isis worship in Egypt faced increasing restrictions under Roman religious policies. Women who served traditional Egyptian goddesses faced particular challenges during periods of foreign rule. Greek and Roman concepts of appropriate female religious authority often conflicted with traditional Egyptian practices that had granted significant spiritual power to women, creating gender-specific forms of religious persecution that targeted both spiritual practice and social identity. Historians still argue whether foreign rulers' religious policies toward Egypt were primarily motivated by genuine theological conviction, practical administrative necessity, or deliberate cultural suppression designed to prevent nationalist resistance. But the cumulative impact on Egyptian religious identity was profound regardless of the underlying motivations. The missionary activities that accompanied foreign conquest added another dimension to religious persecution in Egypt. Persian Zoroastrian concepts, Greek philosophical schools, and later Christian missionaries didn't just offer alternative spiritual options. They actively competed for converts in ways that turned religious choice into a form of political statement about loyalty to competing cultural systems. Egyptian families found themselves navigating not just changing official religious requirements, but also social pressure from foreign communities that viewed conversion to their spiritual systems as evidence of cultural sophistication and political wisdom. It was like being caught between competing religious social media platforms, except the platforms represented different civilizations, and choosing the wrong one could affect your family's social and economic prospects for generations. But perhaps most insidiously, foreign religious influence created internal divisions within Egyptian communities, as some families embraced foreign spiritual concepts, while others maintained traditional practices, creating religious civil wars that operated at the household level and turned spiritual choice into a source of family conflict and community division. The linguistic impact of foreign religious influence added another layer of complexity to Egyptian spiritual life. Sacred texts that had been preserved in hieroglyphic and hieratic scripts were increasingly translated into Greek, Coptic, and later Arabic, creating opportunities for theological reinterpretation that altered traditional religious concepts in subtle but significant ways. Therefore, by the time Christianity arrived in Egypt, the population had already endured over a millennium of foreign religious influence that had created a spiritual landscape so complex and psychologically traumatic that many Egyptians may have welcomed monotheistic simplicity as a relief from centuries of theological chaos, rather than as another form of religious persecution. As we witness these ancient encounters between Egyptian spirituality and foreign religious systems, remember that every translated prayer, every syncretistic deity, every household shrine containing multiple cultural traditions represented families trying to navigate an increasingly complex spiritual landscape, where the wrong religious choice could cost them not just their souls, but their place in a world where even the gods themselves had become immigrants seeking acceptance in an empire that stretched far beyond the Nile's familiar embrace. While ordinary Egyptians learned to navigate the dangerous waters of foreign gods and competing theological requirements, a brave few documented their spiritual trauma in texts that have survived to tell us exactly how it felt to watch your civilization's soul being systematically dissected by successive waves of religious persecution. Picture a scribe named Ipuwer working by lamplight in a hidden chamber, carefully recording the collapse of everything his society had once considered sacred and stable, knowing that his words might be the only testimony to survive the theological apocalypse unfolding around him. But these weren't just historical chronicles or political complaints. These were desperate attempts to preserve the memory of spiritual suffering that might otherwise be forgotten or deliberately erased by whatever religious authorities emerged victorious from the chaos. The mainstream historical fact is remarkable. Egyptian literature contains over 40 distinct texts that describe religious persecution, spiritual chaos, and theological upheaval, providing the most comprehensive ancient record of how religious violence affected ordinary people's daily lives and psychological well-being. Therefore, Egyptian scribes created what might be history's first systematic documentation of religious trauma, preserving testimonies of spiritual suffering that would have otherwise vanished along with the people who experienced it. The Admonitions of Ipuwer remains the most haunting example of this literature of religious despair. Written during the First Intermediate Period, when central authority had collapsed and regional religious conflicts were tearing Egypt apart, Ipuwer's text reads like a trauma survivor's journal, documenting the complete breakdown of cosmic order. "The land turns around, as does a potter's wheel," he writes, describing a world where religious certainties have dissolved and social structures based on spiritual authority have crumbled into chaos. It was like ancient Egypt's version of disaster journalism, except the disaster was theological, and the journalist was documenting the death of gods, rather than the destruction of cities. But Ipuwer's lamentations reveal something more profound than simple nostalgia for religious stability. His text shows how deeply Egyptians understood the connection between spiritual disruption and social collapse, recognizing that attacking religious foundations meant attacking the psychological infrastructure that made civilization possible. The coded language developed in these resistance texts reveals the sophisticated literary techniques Egyptian writers used to discuss forbidden topics without attracting persecution. Religious literature from periods of theological oppression often employed metaphorical references, historical allegories, and symbolic imagery that allowed readers to understand critiques of current religious policies while providing authors with plausible deniability if questioned by authorities. Therefore, Egyptian literature became a form of spiritual samizdat, preserving dangerous ideas about religious freedom and theological diversity in texts that appeared to be harmless historical narratives or traditional religious poetry. The quirky archaeological evidence shows just how seriously Egyptian scribes took their role as preservers of forbidden religious knowledge. Papyrus caches have been discovered buried in desert locations far from major settlements, containing religious texts wrapped in protective materials and sealed in pottery jars designed to preserve them for centuries. Some caches include multiple copies of the same texts, suggesting coordinated efforts to ensure controversial religious literature would survive even if individual copies were discovered and destroyed. It was like ancient Egypt's version of distributed backup systems for dangerous data, except the data was theological and the danger was eternal damnation rather than mere data loss. The hymns and prayers, preserved from periods of religious upheaval, often contained double meanings that allowed practitioners to maintain traditional devotions while appearing to conform to new religious requirements. Scribes developed techniques for writing prayers that could be interpreted as addressing either traditional or newly approved deities, depending on the reader's theological perspective. Women played crucial roles in preserving religious literature during periods of persecution, often maintaining copies of traditional texts in household archives when official religious libraries were being purged. Some of the most important religious manuscripts have been found in domestic contexts, suggesting that private preservation efforts by women may have been more effective than official institutional attempts to protect controversial texts. But the psychological cost of maintaining this literary resistance was enormous. Scribes who preserved forbidden religious texts lived with the constant fear that their efforts to document spiritual suffering might become evidence of their own heretical beliefs, making them targets for the very persecution they were attempting to record. The prayer collections that emerged from periods of religious chaos reveal the creative desperation of people trying to maintain spiritual practices when traditional religious formulas had become dangerous. These texts often combine elements from multiple theological systems, creating hybrid devotional literature that reflected the complex religious realities faced by ordinary Egyptians navigating competing spiritual requirements. Historians still argue whether the preservation of controversial religious literature during periods of persecution was primarily motivated by scholarly concern for historical accuracy, genuine religious conviction, or practical recognition that theological fashions might change again and forbidden texts might become valuable in the future. The underground distribution networks that developed around forbidden religious texts created informal scholarly communities that maintained theological knowledge outside official religious institutions. These networks often included former priests, displaced temple workers, and educated women who had lost official religious roles but retained knowledge of traditional practices. Therefore, religious persecution inadvertently created the first documented examples of grassroots intellectual resistance movements in human history, proving that attempts to eliminate ideas through violence often ensure their preservation through desperate creativity. While Egyptian scribes preserved their ancient spiritual traditions in hidden manuscripts, the final act of Egypt's religious tragedy was already being written by a new faith that would accomplish what centuries of internal warfare and foreign conquest had failed to achieve: the complete transformation of a civilization's soul. Picture the Great Serapeum in Alexandria on a spring day in 391 AD. For over 6 centuries, this magnificent temple has served as the spiritual heart of Greco-Egyptian religion, where the god Serapis, a fusion of Osiris and Greek deities, has presided over one of the ancient world's most successful religious syntheses. But Christian mobs, supported by imperial authority and armed with religious fervor that makes previous theological conflicts look like polite disagreements, are gathering outside with sledgehammers, torches, and a divine mandate to eliminate every trace of Egypt's pagan past. The mainstream historical fact is definitive. The destruction of the Serapeum in 391 AD marked the beginning of a systematic campaign that closed over 200 major temples throughout Egypt within 50 years, ending nearly 4,000 years of continuous pharaonic religious practice. Therefore, Christianity didn't just offer Egyptians an alternative spiritual path. It implemented the most thorough and successful religious persecution in Egyptian history, accomplishing in decades what centuries of previous reforms had failed to achieve. The irony was profound. Egypt, which had survived Persian conquest, Greek rule, and Roman occupation while maintaining its essential religious identity, finally succumbed to a faith that had itself emerged from monotheistic traditions that Egypt had helped inspire through Akhenaten's earlier experiments with solar worship. But this final religious transformation differed fundamentally from previous upheavals. Christianity didn't just replace Egyptian gods with new deities. It declared the entire conceptual framework of Egyptian religion to be demonic deception, making every aspect of traditional spiritual practice not just wrong, but actively evil. Consider the psychological trauma experienced by the last generation of traditional Egyptian priests. These men had dedicated their lives to serving gods whose temples had stood for millennia, whose rituals had been performed since before the pyramids were built, whose spiritual authority had seemed as permanent as the Nile's annual flood. Now they faced Christian authorities who declared that their life's work hadn't just been misguided, it had been satanic collaboration that endangered their eternal souls and the souls of everyone they had served. It was like discovering that your career in medicine had actually been practicing witchcraft, except the discovery came with threats of both legal prosecution and eternal damnation. Therefore, the final collapse of Egyptian religion involved not just institutional change, but profound personal psychological crisis for thousands of people who had to reinterpret their entire understanding of reality, morality, and spiritual purpose. The destruction of the Isis temple at Philae in 535 AD represents perhaps the most symbolically significant moment in this religious transformation. This temple, dedicated to the goddess who had been worshipped for over 3,000 years, was the last functioning shrine of traditional Egyptian religion in the ancient world. When Christian authorities finally closed Philae, they weren't just shutting down another pagan temple. They were ending a religious tradition that stretched back to the dawn of recorded history, severing the last thread connecting contemporary Egypt to its pharaonic past. The quirky archaeological evidence reveals the desperate creativity of the last Egyptian pagans trying to preserve their traditions. Hidden chambers discovered in former temples contain Christian crosses carved directly over traditional Egyptian religious symbols, suggesting that some families maintained dual religious practices well into the Islamic period. Some Coptic Christian texts include prayers that are barely modified versions of ancient Egyptian hymns, with Jesus substituted for Osiris and Mary for Isis. Spiritual recycling that preserved traditional forms while transforming their content. It was like running ancient software on a new operating system. The interface looked familiar, but the underlying code had been completely rewritten to serve different theological purposes. But the human cost of this final transformation was staggering. Families that had maintained traditional religious practices for generations found themselves forced to choose between their ancestral faith and their social survival in a rapidly Christianizing society. Women who had served as traditional healers using plant medicines and ritual procedures blessed by Egyptian goddesses discovered that their knowledge was now classified as witchcraft, punishable by death. Craftsmen who had specialized in creating religious objects for traditional worship found their skills not just obsolete, but criminally suspect. The educational transformation was particularly brutal. Traditional Egyptian schools, which had been based in temples and had preserved literacy, mathematics, astronomy, and medicine alongside religious instruction, were systematically closed and replaced with Christian institutions that taught different curricula using different languages and different conceptual frameworks. Therefore, the conversion to Christianity didn't just change what Egyptians believed, it fundamentally altered how they thought, what they knew, and how they understood the relationship between human knowledge and divine truth. The linguistic impact of this transformation was profound. Coptic, the final form of the ancient Egyptian language, became primarily a vehicle for Christian religious expression, while hieroglyphic writing, the script that had preserved Egyptian religious and cultural knowledge for over 3 millennia, was gradually forgotten by all but a few scholars who maintained it in secret. Historians still argue whether the rapid success of Christianity in Egypt was primarily due to genuine spiritual appeal, effective institutional organization, or the accumulated trauma of centuries of religious persecution that made Egyptians eager to embrace any faith that promised stability and protection from further theological upheaval. The monastery movement that emerged in Egypt during this period created new forms of religious community that incorporated some elements of traditional Egyptian spirituality while rejecting its theological foundations. Egyptian Christian monks developed ascetic practices that resembled ancient Egyptian religious disciplines but served completely different spiritual purposes. The papyrus industry, which had supported Egyptian scribal culture for millennia, adapted to serve Christian needs by producing biblical texts, theological treatises, and administrative documents for the new religious institutions that were replacing traditional temples throughout the Nile Valley. But perhaps most tragically, the knowledge preservation systems that had sustained Egyptian civilization through previous religious upheavals finally failed during the Christian transformation. The scribal schools that had maintained continuity of learning through Persian, Greek, and Roman rule were eliminated, creating an irreversible break in the transmission of traditional Egyptian knowledge. The last priests of the ancient gods faced impossible choices as their world disappeared around them. Some converted to Christianity and attempted to integrate their traditional wisdom into new theological frameworks. Others maintained their beliefs in secret, creating hidden networks that preserved fragments of ancient practice for centuries after official paganism had ended. A few chose martyrdom, refusing to abandon gods they had served faithfully despite facing persecution that made previous religious conflicts seem mild by comparison. These final devotees of Isis, Osiris, and Amun became the last links in a chain of spiritual practice that had connected Egypt to its deepest past, and when they died, that chain was finally broken. Therefore, Egypt's transformation into a Christian civilization represented not just religious change, but cultural death and rebirth on a scale that had never been achieved by previous conquerors, creating a society that was geographically Egyptian, but spiritually alien to everything that had defined Egyptian identity for over 3,000 years. The Coptic Christian culture that emerged from this transformation preserved some elements of ancient Egyptian identity while fundamentally altering others, creating a hybrid civilization that was neither fully ancient nor completely foreign, a new form of Egyptian identity built on the ruins of the old, like a cathedral constructed from the stones of demolished temples. As we contemplate this final chapter in our journey through Egypt's religious trauma, remember that the last priest who performed the ancient rituals, the last scribe who could read hieroglyphs, the last person who remembered the old prayers, when they died, they took with them not just individual knowledge, but the living connection to a civilization that had touched the divine for longer than any other culture in human history, proving that even gods can die when the people who believe in them are finally convinced to forget their names. And so we reach the end of our journey through the sacred sands of Egypt, where we've witnessed the rise and fall of gods, the destruction of temples, and the transformation of souls across millennia of religious upheaval that shaped one of history's greatest civilizations. We began with a simple farmer named Keti, worried about cosmic order and the fragile balance of Ma'at. We watched Akhenaten shatter that balance with revolutionary fervor, witnessed the brutal counter-revolution that followed, and traced the cycles of religious violence that echoed through Egyptian history, like ripples from stones thrown into the sacred waters of the Nile. Throughout our exploration, we've seen how religious reforms in ancient Egypt followed predictable yet devastating patterns. Each transformation began with promises of spiritual renewal and divine favor. Each ended with broken families, destroyed communities, and traumatized populations who learned to navigate theology like a minefield where wrong steps could cost everything they held sacred. The human cost behind Egypt's magnificent monuments becomes clear when we understand the religious violence that shaped their creation. Every pyramid built during theological upheaval, every temple destroyed and rebuilt according to new spiritual requirements, every work of art defaced and recreated to serve different gods, all of it represents not just architectural achievement, but human suffering on a scale that's difficult to comprehend. We've witnessed how ordinary Egyptians, mothers teaching prayers to their children, craftsmen creating religious art, farmers depending on divine protection for their crops, became collateral damage in cosmic wars fought by pharaohs and priests who claimed divine authority for their earthly ambitions. The patterns we've explored reveal timeless truths about the relationship between spiritual belief and political power. Religious reform became a tool for social control, economic redistribution, and psychological manipulation that went far beyond simple theological disagreement. When rulers claimed divine mandate for their policies, resistance became not just political opposition, but cosmic treason. Perhaps most tragically, we've seen how each attempt to restore religious stability actually created conditions for future upheaval. The trauma of persecution bred paranoia about spiritual innovation. The fear of divine abandonment made communities vulnerable to authoritarian religious control. The cycles of revolution and counter-revolution became self-perpetuating as each generation sought revenge for the spiritual suffering inflicted by their predecessors. Women and children bore unique burdens throughout these upheavals, losing not just religious comfort, but their roles as spiritual guardians of families and communities. The destruction of temple economies eliminated traditional sources of female authority and economic independence, while children grew up learning that spiritual beliefs were dangerous luxuries rather than sources of comfort and meaning. The foreign conquests that brought new gods and theological requirements added layers of complexity that made religious identity increasingly fragmented and precarious. Egyptians learned to code switch between different spiritual systems depending on political circumstances, creating religious identities that were strategic rather than authentic, practical rather than profound. Yet through all this trauma, we've also witnessed remarkable resilience. The scribes who preserved forbidden texts in desert caches, the families who maintained secret shrines, the communities that developed coded languages for discussing dangerous spiritual topics, all of them demonstrated that human spiritual creativity can survive even the most systematic attempts at theological destruction. The literature of resistance that emerged from these dark periods provides some of history's most powerful testimonies to the importance of religious freedom and the devastating cost of spiritual persecution. These ancient voices still cry out across the centuries, reminding us that the human need for meaning and transcendence cannot be easily eliminated by political decree or religious authority. Christianity's final triumph in Egypt represented the end of pharaonic religious tradition, but also the beginning of new forms of spiritual expression that incorporated elements of ancient wisdom while serving different theological purposes. Even in transformation, something of Egypt's spiritual heritage survived, adapted, and continued to influence human understanding of the divine. As we drift towards sleep tonight, perhaps we can find some comfort in remembering that despite centuries of religious violence, spiritual persecution, and theological upheaval, the human capacity for faith, hope, and transcendence proves stronger than any earthly authority's power to destroy it completely. The gods of ancient Egypt may have died when the last priest who remembered their names finally fell silent. But the human longing for the sacred that they represented continues in new forms, speaking new languages, serving new purposes, but still reaching toward the same eternal questions that troubled and comforted our ancestors along the Nile. In the end, perhaps that's the most profound lesson from Egypt's religious trauma, that while gods may be mortal, the human spirit that creates and believes in them is surprisingly eternal, capable of surviving even the destruction of entire civilizations and emerging, scarred but unbroken, to build new temples in the ruins of the old. Sleep well, dear traveler, and may your dreams be filled not with the religious terrors of ancient Egypt, but with the quiet knowledge that somewhere in the darkness, the sacred flame still burns, tended by hearts that refuse to let hope die, no matter how many times the gods themselves are murdered by those who claim to serve them. Sweet dreams from the eternal sands of time.